We got a pretty good portion of the video on being a cynic to get through. Just a quick reminder, a cynic is someone that has their arms folded, knows everything, kind of says can't be done, whatever idea you may have, and so they're talking about being a cynic. And when you look at this chart between humility and hope and being a disciple of Jesus, the cynic is this bottom left where they're low on hope and they're low on humility. So, well, they're not a very humble person. They think they know, they think they have the answers. So, anyway, so that's what we're talking about today, and then we'll go from there. I've got some questions for you when we get to a breaking point.
Create the reality it fears. So there's a posture that thinks no one's trustworthy, everyone's ultimate.
Let me start that just a little bit. There we go.
Cynicism is at odds with being a disciple because cynicism tends to create the reality it fears. So there's a posture that thinks no one's trustworthy, everyone's ultimately in it for themselves, and there's a kind of a protective crouch, protecting one's vulnerability. Jesus does not have this problem. He's committing himself to people in a way that actually engages with them and loves them because he has a realistic view of the universe and also a long-term view of the universe, that the light does shine in the darkness. With cynicism, you ultimately start to see the darkness but not the light. There's always a danger of either an overly bleak view of the world or an overly bright view of the world. So if somebody has a utopian sense of everything is going to get corrected in the world or in my community or in my church, those are usually the people who, when they're disappointed, fall really, really quickly into cynicism. Rather than having an understanding of the world is sinful, the world is fallen, but the world is created and the world is good. Both of those truths are held together, and both of those truths about human beings are held together. Human beings are reflecting God, the image of God, and every human being is fallen. The cynic sometimes dismisses issues of injustice ultimately, but more often there's a kind of resignation that sees even small steps toward justice or righteousness as being just veneer, not really real. And so you really don't have an understanding of what's happening around you once you take that stance. When the cynic thinks about justice, sometimes the default is to say, here are all the times we have sought justice before and it hasn't happened. So therefore, it's not going to happen. Think about Jesus' teaching on the Good Samaritan. The cynic's posture would say, it doesn't matter if there's somebody beaten on the side of the road. This is one person. You're never going to stop violence happening on the Jericho Road. What good does it do? We can go and bandage this guy up. He's going to be beaten again. Let's just keep on walking. Or you can see a cynical response in Jesus' story of the prodigal son. The older brother says, look, you can give a party for this kid, you can welcome him back, he can cry all over you, he's just going to do it again. And there's a sense in which what the cynic ultimately does is a kind of self-protection that says, you can't hurt me if I never put myself in a place where you can hurt me. And so the way to do that is to say, well, nothing ultimately works. We've done that before. It doesn't work. But that's just not the posture of Jesus. The cynic has this unique challenge of having to pursue hope and humility at the same time. The humility comes in because the cynic thinks, bless your heart, if you knew what I knew, you would never be doing what you're doing. I know that human nature or this situation is bleak. So they need the humility of saying, actually, I may not have a completely accurate rendering of just how bad the situation is or how bad people are. And then they need the hope, because the cynic gets to the point of saying, what difference does it make? Everything is going to be bad and continue to be bad. They need to have this sense of not just the ultimate hope of what God's going to do, but also those reminders that God gives of how he can work through people herein. They sort of need those reminders, and often they're all around them. The reminders are all around them. If they can just step back and pay attention to it, to see all of the ways that people have demonstrated non-cynical, loving actions, sometimes toward them. All the ways in which they have seen justice done, not ultimate justice, but temporal proximate justice done. I can see those signs and say, there really is hope to go forward. Seeking justice can be a path toward discipleship because it's obedience. When what one is seeking is actually justice, you're being obedient to God. So when, for instance, the scripture says, look out for widows and orphans, and particularly a lot about make sure that you don't take away the property of a widow. A lot of widows are vulnerable to having that happen. Make sure that doesn't happen and that you stand up for them. That's obedience in seeing the things that matter to God and having those things matter to you. So the cynical way of responding would be to say, well, this matters to God, but it doesn't matter to me. And if you think of it, we don't think about it this way rationally, but what the assumption is, God cares about this, but if he knew what I knew, he wouldn't. That's not discipleship. If you think about it, if we applied that to the person who says, I'm always going to be a sinner until the coming of Christ, until my resurrection from the dead, there's never going to be a point where I can say I'm without sin. Therefore, why do I even attempt to pursue holiness? Let's just do whatever we want. That's also an unbiblical idea. So the cynic's way of seeing things can seem really rational, because you can find all kinds of examples in which your cynicism seems to be right and seems to be the counterpoint to people who are naive. If the cynic understands the seeking justice in the right way, which is the ability to celebrate when justice happens, then you can have somebody who's freed from cynicism by connection. It's very hard to remain cynical when you're genuinely connected to people, because you then, even though you see the fallenness and you see the darkness, you also see the humanity and what the humanity points to, signpost to Christ. So it puts you in situations where you're able to be confronted with the goodness of God in Christ, even when you're not expecting it. A group of friends of mine were talking about several issues, and one of them said, everybody knows Dr. Martin Luther King, but everybody tends to forget that's Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. She had a concern that the religious motivations and the church motivations of the civil rights movement have been forgotten. As we mentioned before, civil rights movement is one blueprint for the way that a why, what, and a how can work together in a just way. So what can we learn about the religious roots of the civil rights movement? Dr. Dates will tell us.
I don't think people have forgotten about the faith origins of the civil rights movement so much as it is they never learned it. Typically, in your average seminary, the majority culture has not had to learn about the minority culture. So I would say it's time to introduce people of faith to what they never learned. And that is that people like me have the right to vote, have the right to buy property where we want to buy property, to lead industry, because previous generations of faithful Black Christians did not see a separation between the faithfulness of the gospel and the fight for justice in the public square. Those two were never separated. It was the power of the truth of the gospel that made us, and our foreparents, I should say, much like the prophets of old, step into culture and society, not in a theocracy, but to fight for that sense of justice and truth. So there is no civil rights movement apart from the church. So there is no right to vote, ability to buy property, able to go to schools where everyone's apart from the gospel here in these yet to be United States. That night at the Holt Street Baptist Church, once the Montgomery bus boycott begins, it's electric. You can feel the ripples through the nation. I want you to notice this though, as I try to unpack this, that when Rosa Parks decided she would not give up her seat, in the section she was permitted to sit in, the people who carried out the bus boycott did not go to a tavern, to a park district, to a field house. They did not go to a club. They went to the church. And when they went to the church, they sang and they prayed and they sought God for courage and for direction. And when they got it, they followed. So much so that people chose to walk for a whole year in Montgomery, Alabama. I should also note that the idea of the bus boycott movement actually did not originate with Dr. King at Dexter Avenue. It was an idea that another pastor in Louisiana had tried and had a measure of success with before. So you can sense that even the trade-off of ideas combined with the motivation or the impetus to bring it about comes from church, comes from church. So we could go on and on and on, but not just the rallies, but the celebration, the thanksgiving, the praise to God. Where the glory went, it went to God. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Reverend A.W. Wilson or Ralph Abernathy. Those were people who clearly understood that one day when the glory comes, it will be God's. And you hear that refrain, don't you? In King's speaking, mine eyes have seen, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. His truth is marching on. I think that the civil rights movement was as much of a revival in American history as would anybody categorize the Great Awakenings or the New Divinity or even some of the more recent pieces that we have seen and heard and celebrate. Because revival is not just an awakening of the soul to the Spirit of God, it is a repentance. It is a flowing out. Something has to come from it. It can't just be that we're in an auditorium singing and praying and crying. It has to be that somebody changes, some people repent, some structures come down. And I think that we have no greater recent memory of revival in America with the church at the fore than the civil rights movement. So that's the why. So we can talk about the how. I wish I could tell you that I fully knew how. It had to be a visit of the Spirit of God. because the preaching that restored the dignity of a people downtrodden hundreds of years, preaching that reignited their belief and their confidence that they could face oppression and opposition, the state for crying out loud, and come on top, had to be true and then empowered by the Spirit of God.
What I think is so important about what Charlie said and what Charlie described is the civil rights movement made concrete all of the values that we've talked about in this curriculum. So the civil rights movement, without question, pursued justice with conviction and courage. They were not compromising in the pursuit of justice. But at the same time, as you saw from what Charlie said, as we know from history, how did they pursue it? How they pursued it really mattered. They prayed for their enemies. They blessed those who persecuted them. They did not respond to cruelty with cruelty in return. In the face of adversity that really we can't comprehend right now in the United States of America. And to be honest, what's so sad, in the face of much less adversity than the adversity that Black Americans faced during the era of Jim Crow, so many Christians are behaving much more aggressively and much worse than the Black Americans facing the fire hoses in Birmingham. That's a stunning thing. When I was younger and we were talking about Christian engagement in politics and how do you engage, how should Christians engage, I was taught very little about the civil rights movement. I would hear about this is what the moral majority is doing, this is what the pro-life movement is doing, or this is what the Christian Coalition is doing. I heard so little about the civil rights movement as a Christian movement.
Yeah.
And it is so important to put the period, no, exclamation point behind the notion that the civil rights movement was a Christian movement, not exclusively Christian. There were Jewish Americans, people from all faiths who assisted, who came alongside the civil rights movement. But it's a beating heart for Black Christian Americans seeking justice with kindness and humility. And it changed this country. The United States is a different place as a result of the civil rights movement. So this idea that sometimes seems to catch some popularity or to distract people from kindness and humility, that somehow they're incompatible with seeking justice, is rebuked by the civil rights movement. It's rebuked by what is arguably the single most successful Christian political movement in American history. And it was one that was steeped in the what and the how. You know, one of the values I strongly believe in is something that I call the legal corollary to the golden rule, which is fight for the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. I tried to put that in practice in my own litigation days. I represented people I disagreed with. I fought for their rights to speak with the same energy that I fought for the rights to speak of people who shared my beliefs, because I believed in this fundamental notion of equality under the law as an absolute precondition to justice. One concrete way that Christians can act justly in this country is by seeking legal equality, equality of equal rights for every American. This is something promised as part of our fundamental social compact that we have not lived up to. But fighting for the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself, one, is a manifest way of acting justly. It's a clear way of pursuing justice. And then number two, in a really interesting way, it also facilitates kindness and humility. when you are fighting for somebody else's rights, you are being kind to them in a very concrete way. They often experience it even more dramatically as kindness when they know that you disagree. It's hard to interpret it as anything other than kindness when you are defending the rights of someone you disagree with. And then the humility aspect of it is also underrated, because what I have found when I defend people I disagree with, when I step into their shoes to make their case in the public square, I learn. I learn why they believe what they believe. I learn where they're coming from. I better learn their arguments. And so that legal corollary to the Golden Rule isn't just a matter of justice, though it absolutely is a matter of justice. It is also a means and a mechanism to achieving kindness and humility. There's a difference between justice and power. Okay, and a lot of people, or liberty and power for that matter, and a lot of people get this confused, because when you have power, in many ways, you don't need justice. You are the justice. When you have power, you don't need liberty. You have authority. And so for a lot of communities in the United States who enjoyed a lot of power, they actually experience liberty as a loss. They can't just do what they want to do. They can't impose their will anymore. They have to make room and make allowances for other people. And that's a change. That's a change. But when you think about what justice is, when you think about what liberty is, for example, what you're talking about is something that is very different from power. Justice is what the powerless should have access to. We often think that justice will reign or that liberty will flourish if we have power. And in fact, it's frequently not the case when you place the pursuit of power as the highest value. What ends up happening is the quest for power becomes the prerequisite to the quest for justice, and then eventually begins to swallow justice entirely. Because, after all, what can we do if we don't have power? Again, you push back to the civil rights movement. Did the Freedom Riders have power? Did the people who had the hoses turned on them in Birmingham have power? How much power did Rosa Parks have? But they could pursue justice even in the absence of power. They kept their eyes focused on justice. And in keeping your eyes focused on justice, you're keeping your eyes focused on the main thing. If your eyes are off of justice, then typically they drift to power. And you presume that justice will follow. And we have enough examples in history of Christians behaving badly with power to know that justice does not always flow from, and in fact frequently does not flow from, Christians in positions of authority. Let's talk about something very difficult. Let's talk about losing. Because it's one thing to look at the civil rights movement and say, look, they pursued justice, they did it with kindness and humility, and they won. They achieved enormous legal and cultural change. They didn't achieve all the change that is necessary, but they achieved enormous cultural change. It's easy to sort of take that and say, so this is how, not only do you do things the way God wants you to do them, but also how you win. And what's really important for us to understand is we are called to live and walk the way God wants us to walk. We are not called to win. That calling to love, to act justly, to love kindness, and to walk humbly is unconditional. It is what we must do even if we lose. Even if we lose. And look, we have a model here. We have a model of what it looks like to lose by the world's eyes. And that model is Jesus. So Jesus has years of ministry on this earth. He comes into a triumphal entry into Jerusalem. There's the palm fronds, covering his way into Jerusalem. And there's just a few days later, he's crucified. The crowd, to the extent that existed, has turned on him, calling for an insurrectionist, Barabbas, to be released instead of Jesus. All of those disciples are almost entirely gone. At the foot of the cross is just a tiny few people who are hanging in there with him in a recent thief convert. And that's it. That doesn't look like winning. And then when Jesus is resurrected, triumphing over death and hell itself, the ultimate triumph, he does not put himself on the throne in Rome. He doesn't do that. He doesn't come back and exact vengeance upon those people who wrongfully crucified him. He appears to just a few people, here and there and here and there, and then ascends, leaving a very small band of embattled disciples. That doesn't look like the kind of victory that we think of when we think of how are Christians going to engage in the public square. Well, you're going to get executed with a few friends around you. And when, by the immense resurrection power of the risen Lord, then section 2.0, you're just going to have a few dozen more friends around you. That's not what we think. But that was the model. We have to put ourselves in the mindset that obedience is winning. That's what winning is. And that obedience isn't optional, that obedience isn't an accessory to our political commitment. It is essential to it, whether we win or lose. I understand that there are folks who would say that kindness or humility is the way to become a doormat, to just lose all the time, right? But here's what I understand. I don't think I have the wisdom of the Apostle Paul to say that these values that were established in absolute terms are in fact, in this time, in this moment, optional for believers. I have to trust. That's my call, is to trust that this is how I am to walk on this earth, and this is how I am to interact with my friends, my neighbors, and my fellow citizens. When I read Micah 6:8, I'm really struck by the words act justly. Okay, so it's not just seek justice, act justly. So there is an element there that is walk the talk, model what you're seeking to achieve. And so that is a high call. It is a high call. It is a lot easier to advocate for justice than it is to act justly. And that's the challenge. You're having to walk your talk. And if we can't embody it, and we never can perfectly, but what it's always doing, that admonition to act justly, it's requiring us to take a hard look at ourselves and not just always have our eyes on other people.
Put my utility stuff up here. All right, so thoughts after that one?
I love the line, there would be no civil rights movement without the church. In fact, I think about so many things in history that we take for granted right now that are purely inspired by Jesus. Many, many things. I think about the plight of women when Jesus entered the world and what he did there. And I think he's right. The civil rights movement in this country is certainly the one huge effort by the church that some people have attempted to hijack and take on as their own, but it was led by people of Jesus.
So, did y'all, I guess this was in the 60s, right? The civil rights movement, so I was just a baby. So, but do we know, any feedback from you guys that were a lot older than me at that time? What do you remember from it? I'd be curious, because did you recognize it as a religious movement?
I was in high school in Detroit, Michigan.
Uh-huh.
I was not raised in the South. And so my awareness, perception, it was something I saw on the news happening. But 66, I was a junior, and integration was ordered, started. Of course, we saw, again, on television, what was happening in Alabama. Our schools were segregated. My elementary, my high school was pretty much all white. And in Detroit, you didn't have school buses because we went to our neighborhood school. But when integration started, then the busing took place with the city, the Detroit, the buses, the public transit. And I remember even then thinking, what would I feel like if I had to get on a bus and be driven 5, 10, 15 miles from my home? And I remember thinking about, how do those parents feel about their small children having to do that? And so we did have, I couldn't tell you how many students, black students, came into the high school. And it was different. It was different. There was a different atmosphere. There was no violence that I was aware of. And in my little shell of friends, I did not have much interaction. I think some of the students, I was by that time in my senior year, and I think some of the students coming in were probably more freshmen and sophomore, so I didn't have a whole lot of, but I just remember feeling like it was really something that was happening someplace else. And as far as a religious, I don't remember my concept, but I think through the years, I've always thought of it more as political than religious.
Did you talk about it in church?
I do not remember a discussion in church of what was happening in integration and the changes. I do not remember.
Right.
I was raised in Marshall County, and a little earlier than Jan life began, but in a small town, I never really saw many black folks until I was on the farm with my grandparents, and they were helpers, workers. We were segregated, and never discussed it, never thought about it. It was, I don't know, it was just like another group of people that we had no association with and didn't talk about. And later on, when the civil rights movement started, I was in college primarily, I guess. And like Jan, what I saw was basically what was on the news. Again, it was never discussed. Guys in college did not discuss it. There were a few there, very few. But I don't know, it was like they didn't exist, sort of in my growing up days.
I grew up in Abilene, Texas, that time frame. We moved there in '62. But Mom and Dad were both born in Birmingham, but they never really talked about it that much. They integrated the schools there in '68, but we, our whole time that we were there, we went to school with the Mexican group, and I mean, it's just nothing that really we ever thought too much about, to be honest with you. I think the kids that, when they shut their school down, integrated them into our school, I think it was more of a shock for them than it was for anything, because they had their own high school. And they just integrated them into our school with us. But I know later on, I had two sisters younger than me. One of them was 2 years younger, another one was 4 years, and they struggled a little more than we did. But I think it was so new when it first happened, that wasn't really a big issue. And mom and dad just never did really talk about it that much, you know, like I said, like, they, you know, even though they were born and raised in a completely different era, but they just never did really say that much about it. So, and the town didn't, there wasn't that much going on around town. I mean, and there's lots of churches in Abilene. I mean, there, not only is the Church of Christ prevalent out there, but there's Baptist church and there's a Methodist church out there too. And they make up a, you know, a big, probably 85% of that town. So but it just wasn't, you know, anything that went on very much there.
Yeah, right.
My father graduated from graduate school in '63, and in '64 we moved to Montgomery, Alabama, and he taught at Alabama Christian College there for a few years, and Alabama Christian College was supposedly one of the earlier colleges in the South that integrated. And my dad was very pleased about that, and that's one thing that attracted him there. But that was at a time, you know, when my first memories were forming, and my first memories are from Montgomery, Alabama. And like the march from Selma to Montgomery was like the first national event I can remember from the news. And my dad was a speech teacher, so I was just a little bit, you know, aware of things politically, I guess, a bit at an early age. And it was not the kind of place I would want to spend the rest of my life. Definitely. We did move to Columbus, Ohio in late '67. But if any of you all have never been to Martin Luther King's birthplace in Atlanta, I would recommend you go there and see it. It's a very interesting place. He's also buried there, and there's museums there about him. If you've never been there, I'd recommend going.
So let me ask a question. I mean, let's just back up just a little bit. So should Christians engage in justice pursuits in our society?
So you've got to define your boundaries of justice pursuits in regard to the scripture. For example, Paul tells us to live peaceably, do all these things within the church, and to live peaceably with others outside. And there's instructions of what to do with those inside, and then we have abilities to support those outside. So I guess we need to define what you're saying.
So is that a yes? Just got to do it the right way?
I think so, yeah.
You think so? Anybody else? Yes.
This won't answer your question. I feel like the answer is yes, but one of the last points he made in the video was something like it's more important to act justly than to advocate, but he didn't say advocate for justice, did he?
Yes.
He did say that. So if as Christians, if we live in a way that we act justly as often as we can make ourselves or are led to, that would solve the problem, it seems. Of course, it's too late for that at this point. I don't know. Justice belongs to the Lord. So what is that?
But doesn't he call us to pursue justice? Does he not?
I feel like he does.
Yes.
I'm having trouble thinking of what some everyday type examples would be.
Well, that's what I gave you as an assignment. Y'all are supposed to come back and tell me some injustices that we could talk about. But go ahead. You're having trouble because you don't know what justice we might be talking about.
What are some examples?
Let's pretend hypothetically you lived in the time of the '60s. All right. So in you're dealing. Well, maybe some of us maybe actually lived during that time, but you don't have to pretend. And what should a Christian have done? How should they have acted in that time frame? Should they have been marching with Martin Luther King?
I think that we probably should have taken up the mantle along with them.
Mhm.
And there were some agitators from the north that did that.
Mhm.
On a local basis, there was probably one church up the road that was more justice-minded than the status quo in the South,
Mhm.
you know?
Why would they have not, Jimmy? Why would, I mean, today we look back, we say, it's so obvious, right? They were being mistreated.
Well,
Right.
if you look at history, you have to look at where you are in the world. You're in the South, you're in Tennessee. You could go to places right now still in the South there's no different, the thought process.
Mhm.
They may not speak it. But I can think of some places that I've been, as a young college student in Memphis, and go home with a boy that was from a state right south of Memphis, and it was like stepping back in time. I was shocked.
Yeah.
There still was an entrance for people of color, and it was still used, and that was in the late 80s.
Mhm.
And I questioned that. He said, well, that's just how it is. So, I mean, I was raised, I was too young to remember what was going on, but, you know, even if my dad or mom was still alive, they would have similar comments as most people here. Well, it really didn't bother me. I mean, it was, because that was the status quo. You didn't talk about it. That's what happened. They just didn't speak it. Did that mean it wasn't happening? It was happening.
Do you think they saw it?
Sure they saw it.
They did see it.
Sure they saw it.
Mhm.
Did they act on it? No. I'd say 90% of the churches in this town didn't act on it. Steve, am I wrong? I mean, you were a little older than me.
You're exactly right, Jimmy.
It was just, you know, they did not speak it, but it was happening.
Yes, Celia.
I had a very disappointing situation happen with me in college. The first two black students, they were female. I was at a Christian college that were admitted and were in the dorm. My best friend said, my mother said, why are they here? They don't deserve to be here. Just broke my heart. I mean, I never participated. I started saying this in a civil rights situation because I didn't see it like these men were talking about. But I was right in the middle of a protest in Chattanooga, not realizing that it was as bad as things were. I went from the building I worked in for TVA over to a building a little ways away that I had to carry contract bids back and forth. I went traipsing out to do that, and people that I worked with forbid me to do it anymore. I mean, I guess that was what they should have done because everything wasn't safe looking, but I charged right out, not even thinking what was going on.
Mhm.
And they were going down the street between our building and another one. And, you know, I just, like you said, I just really didn't think about it. I mean, I always thought, my mother taught us that they were as good as us, but they had their place and we had ours. And she had some best friends that were black, but they didn't go to school with her. It was more that my granddaddy had worked with them farming and stuff like, and not as they were servants, but he just interacted with them, and Mama was taught that they were good people and God loved them just like He loved us, but they should be in their place and we should be in ours.
And you got something to say?
Yeah, I hate that it's on TV or recorded.
Yeah, stop.
I think that
and criticizing so much as I am saying, wonder what I would have done if I had been there. And also, what is it we're doing today that, man, we're just completely oblivious to that we should be paying attention to?
Hey, Gerald.
Yeah.
So,
Wait just a minute. Melissa raised her hand.
It's, I look at it as kind of like on TV or like on any other thing. The first time something happens, you know, it's kind of like a shock situation, shock value or something. But as things happen more and more, we as a country or whatever, our families, we get desensitized to things. And, you know, then you know, you hear of something or you see something, oh, well, that happens all the time and there's nothing we can do about it. It's just part of it now.
Right.
And I think we just, you know, like, before it was like cuss words on TV, or it's like immorality on TV or something. It's just part of it now. And you feel like it's just so common or it's so prevalent that there's nothing you can do about it anymore. And everybody just, well, that's the way it is, that's the way it is, that's the way it is. And it's not something new anymore and it's not something so small, it's just rampant, you know, kind of thing. We get so used to something that we feel, well, we're desensitized to what it is. And, you know, you just can't, we feel like we can't stop it anymore.
Well, the Senate, can you imagine the Senate in Martin Luther King's discussion group about what their plan was? I think he maybe said this on the video. You know, we're going to peaceably march. We're not going to retaliate. We're going to let them do the worst possible things to us, and we're going to change the world by doing that. The Senate would probably say, no, you're going to get killed. And, you know, you're going to get abused. You're never going to be able to change this. The Senate would have not allowed it to go forward. So I thought about that. I mean, if he'd have told me that, this is not going to work. But, you know, a skeptic would have said, well, but I'll go with you. I'll go with you. You had a comment over here. Sean did, I know.
You want to go first?
Oh, Rick, go ahead.
so when I go back to scripture and I think about some of the things that the church did as a church that exemplified justice, and some of the things was children and babies that were cast out because they were deformed or had a problem. The church got them and incorporated them into the body. When widows and others were being abused and forgotten, the church got engaged. When those that were outcast, the church brought the outcast into the body. Now, did they go marching down the streets in front of Rome? No, because you can see the apologetic letters about just the activities of what the church did that were good and godly. That example was seen by the community, by others.
Good.
You know, and the Romans, I mean, there were some that tried to use it against them, but the apologetic letters show us something different. And I think that, so let's bring us to 2024 and some of the things and that we get cynical about. We do have a tendency to get a little bit cynical about those that are on the streets, right? Those that we see at the Walmart parking lot or Kroger's parking lot. I mean, I get cynical. I have to admit it, because we get a lot of them, and then when you start looking at stuff, there are a lot of things that cause that. And so what am I supposed to do with that in God's kingdom? You know, that's something we have to wrestle with. I think that the things that we do for, like, during the winter shelter, I think it's a great thing. I think the things we do for the food drive are a great thing. But we're not marching down the streets of Jackson Street, right? We're doing things as a church. And the other thing is justice is about standing up for what's right.
kind of, compounding upon that is, yeah, I feel like we as a church should speak out more about justice, morality. There's a lot of things going on these days that we as a church should not identify with. And in the same aspect, learning how to do that with grace and humility and mercy, it's this conflicting thing that, he was talking about, but we still have to have the ability to speak up, but in humility. It's just, that's something that I fight with all the time, Where
One,
that,
go along with that, Sean, that he said, justice, helping an individual or a group of people get justice when you don't agree with maybe everything they say. Did y'all pick up on that?
I did.
And we want people to have justice. That doesn't mean I have to agree with them on everything. And that's hard, isn't it? Because then you identify with them. People start putting you in that group.
I have to, I choked on it just a little bit. I think that's one I've got to think about quite a bit. I think just as a lot of non-Christians, and a lot of non-Christian thought tried to hijack the civil rights system, I think justice can be hijacked also. What Rick, you asked earlier, you got to qualify justice. And I think justice apart from the love of God, justice apart from the recognition that there'll never be justice until God reigns, all those things are factored into it. Right now, where are we as a church when we've got a country where college tuition is such that no regular person can go to college without coming out with an incredible amount of debt, can't do anything. I mean, that's injustice. Where are we in a medical system where you got to have money to see a doctor? If you don't have money, you got to have no money, then you can see one. But if you've got any amount of money, you're going to lose it all. Where are we when our old people go to the nursing home and every dime they've ever had gets sapped away from them before they die? There's just a world of injustices out there. And I guess I question, what is the church's role in those? And I don't want to be a cynic. I won't say I wouldn't do anything. But, there's just so much out there coming at you. Those are really tough decisions. Where are we with injustice when we look at a whole generation of kids that right now can't talk to you because they're on the computer the whole time? They can't even talk to you. And we all know that's going on. And we all see violence that comes out of all this stuff, and yet nothing's said because of our American system of personal freedom to do whatever you want to do. I mean, it's just, the questions you're asking are incredibly complicated.
But Gerald, I'm worried. I don't know the answers, but as a church, as a collective church, I think we should be careful about saying our church believes this and we're going to fight this. I think we are all individuals. We all have our individual missions. God told, the scripture, act justly. Each one of us individually need to do that. But collectively as a church, we need to be a place that anybody can come here and we can take care of them and they can be, it needs to be, I guess what I'm trying to say is a safe haven for them and they can be in here. And I don't have to agree with everybody inside our church family. We can individually and individually go out and do work. But as a church, putting the stamp of us all, I think we got to be very careful in that.
Yeah.
And I think that's, what it goes back to them saying they had a zealot and a tax collector. Completely, totally different people on the spectrum. But together as a church, they agreed with the mission of the church, which is to go out and take care of people who have been treated unjustly. They're not fixing it and agreeing on how to fix it.
Right.
They're agreeing on the work of taking care of the people. Right. And I think that you can have both of those thoughts. Anyway.
So I think you'll talk about partisanship in the next video. And that, so he's gonna pull this kind of back to politics a little bit in the next one. But notice what we've done in our discussion here. We're talking about an individual issue or some individual issues and how we, as a Christian, approach those things like Jesus would. I mean, to Rick's point, we're not trying to make a name for ourselves. We're trying to promote and do what Jesus wants to do. And what we didn't get to, and I want to ask this question a little bit about, is it always clear what justice is?
No.
I mean, I think if I'd lived in the 60s, I would probably heard things like we say today, it's so disruptive. Why would you do that? You know, why would you go through the trouble of trying to create this problem? I mean, what's the justice of sending my kid all across town? Or, so, I mean, I think when you talk about justice, it's very complicated. It's not clear. When you look back, you kind of think, well, yeah, I can see that now, but back then it didn't look so clear. And I think we do that in a lot of things in our world. We try to make a simple answer. Now remember when he started this thing is you take these big complex problems and somebody walks in and they give you a easy answer. If you just follow this, it'll all be okay. And it just doesn't work that way. These are complicated issues. We give each other grace, talking about them, listen to each other, and give the other person the right to have their opinion. I mean, you may learn something. You don't just assume they're trying to do whatever. They're trying to figure out these complicated issues, and we do it together. So, all right, y'all go home.